This evening is inspired by one man, Alain Bertaud. He and his wife, Marie-Agnès, a satellite image specialist, have worked for 50 cities around the world, leaving their mark on every one of them. Alain's first job was working for none other than Le Corbusier, the god of modernist planning, designing Chandigarh, the capital of Punjab. But it was as principal urban planner of the World Bank that he got to experience and observe the broad diversity of world cities. Lynn and I met with Alain and Marie-Agnès for a long lunch, and the time we spent with them was magical. We heard stories of so many cities and exotic places, trekking through deserts and jungles, laying out subdivisions, and immersing in different cultures, witnessing the transition of Russia and China from planned cities to market-based cities, not to mention having his appendix taken out without anesthesia. We learned especially that they were a team. This was not restless urban planner dragging reluctant wife and family around the world. If anything, Marie-Agnès was the one with the bags packed, ready to go, and wanting to get on the road, and they loved all their adventures. After almost 6 decades of being immersed in cities of every variety, Alain summarized his insights in an outstanding, internationally acclaimed book called Order Without Design. I contacted them about Vancouver. Vancouver is such a great city, but it has real problems, like affordability. One of the great curses that prevents us from solving our problems is that we keep winning awards. The best city of this or the best city of that. It makes it hard to convince people that we need to change, that we need advice. They agreed to come to Vancouver for a public salon and a series of workshops and gatherings. When our cher Marie-Agnès received a serious diagnosis and COVID raised another of its many heads, we decided the public salon would be a step in their journey to Vancouver. They would participate in the public salon on screen, and the workshops and gatherings would be this spring. They have made Vancouver their goal for healing. They have attended all 5 of our urban Zoom lunches with outstanding speakers like Nathaniel Lauster, Eric Villegomez, Gordon Price, Bruce Hayden, Oliver Hartleben, and we will continue our urban lunches. When they arrive next spring, we will present ideas for Metro Vancouver inspired by Alain's book, Order Without Design. Meanwhile, we will all be sending Marie-Agnès our most positive thoughts of strength and health. So let us begin with some initial insights from Alain Bertaud, based in New York City, who will be having a late night thanks to all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the big screen, Alain Bertaud.
I would like to start this talk by defining what I mean by markets. We are going to speak a lot about market, and I think that many people have different definition. For me, markets is a natural phenomenon. It's a bit like gravity. It is certainly not a god. It's not a religion. And it's not a moral rule or anything. This is just a natural phenomenon. And I think that many times markets produce interesting results and sometimes they don't. Depending on your opinion, you may want to reduce the importance of markets, especially in the outcome in cities, but Some people like me think that market have an interesting role to play, not everywhere, we will discuss that, but sometime. Now, whether your opinion is that market should be curbed or market should be encouraged, if you do not understand market, you are never going to achieve anything, including controlling markets. So, I compare markets sometimes to gravity. Gravity is everywhere. And if you want to beat gravity, like for instance, go into a balloon or, or build an airplane or an helicopter, you better understand how gravity works. Now, this is exactly the same thing for markets. So let us start with that after this warning. So for me, cities are labor markets. Now, a lot of people who like cities think that, the labor market, cities are much more than labor markets. There are many things we like in cities, which are different, which are, for instance, restaurant, a museum, concert hall, jogging along an avenue or a perspective, going on a picnic in a park. All these things are possible if labor markets are working well. If the labor market are the foundation of all the things we like in cities. If they don't work, all these things disappear. For instance, we have the recent example of Detroit, which labor market collapsed and everything that was, interesting in Detroit collapsed at the same time, including the museum and the music industry. So, what is important about those markets? First, market should, the word markets is important. Labor market means that anybody in a city or even in metropolitan area is able to select a job and the best job according to its skills. So the larger is the labor market, the more possibility of interesting job are there. At the same time, the possibility of changing job, this is very important. I learned that when I worked in Russia and in China, that before reform, most of the people there were allocated to a job and they stay in the same job or at least in the same industry all their life. And that, as you can imagine, created an enormous frustration. So this is how do those markets work? Well, first, you need, of course, a land use. And this land use, to me, is generated by spontaneous order. It is really firms and households who should be able to decide how much land they consume, how much floor space, and where. Now, in order to do that, they need an infrastructure, and infrastructure, especially large-scale infrastructure, are not created by markets. Infrastructure are designed from top down. If you design a subway system or a sewer system, it has to be designed by engineers. They have to take into account, the population and things like that, but it has to be top down. Now, for me, the role of planners is precisely to provide the infrastructure that the market will not provide, but in order to serve this spontaneous order where people locate and firms locate where they want. So the land use of a city must be driven by demand. It should not be, I don't believe, in spite of my education that they call the Beaux-Arts, I don't believe that there is an optimum design and that a genius designer can design a city and be optimum. I think that a city has to be designed by its inhabitants. Finally, I will start then looking a bit at some slides that I have borrowed from the previous Salon. So in particular, the slide of Jens and Nathanael and Julia and Eric. So this is a Google Earth image of Vancouver. Now, what's interesting with Vancouver is that it has, the CBD is eccentric. It's not in the center of the city the way it is in city like London, Paris, or Moscow. And most cities which are on the seaside, where are important ports, are usually like that. But what is interesting, I think, is an asset for Vancouver, is that it extends in a large grid. The entire metropolitan area is covered by a grid. That provides Vancouver with a possibility of mobility, which again will make the functioning of land market much better than cities like, again, Paris or London or Moscow, which have a radioconcentric system of road. The next thing are densities. And here I'm borrowing these 3D maps from Jens. And we see that there is a very high density in the CBD, as can be expected. But then we see that the pattern of density are kind of a little erratic. In particular, we see just to the south of the CBD that we have a drop of density, which to me is probably not, not driven by demand. It's driven by very rigid regulation. And I wonder if some of the problem of affordability in Vancouver are not really caused by some rigidities in the regulation. Now, I don't want to blame zoning for the high prices of Vancouver or any other cities. There is no silver bullet. High prices come from a lot of things which have to be reformed. It could be in the building industry. It could be in the way building permits are distributed. It could be because of uncertainty about decision about land use. It could be a lot of different things. Again, I am not, I'm not familiar with Vancouver, so I would certainly not give solution. So this is the map of the zoning. And again, I think there will be speaker here who will describe it and, much more knowledgeably than I can do it. Now, finally, when we are talking about affordability, we have to take into account the enormous difference between different households who are living in the city. So here I represent with data which were provided to me by Eric Villagomez, I represent the income distribution curve of Vancouver, and horizontally we have the income per year, and vertically we have the number of households. So every bar here represents the number of households within an income bracket. When we look at affordability, we do not have to say low income, medium income, or things like that. We have to look at every one of these little bar and ask ourselves, where can they find a house? Where can they, and how far is it from their job? If it is more than 1 hour, we have a big, big problem. And we should try as planners to design a transport system which serve the land use so that everybody in this income curve have an access to their job within less than 1 hour. Finally, it is true that if you look at the very low income, probably they will need some assistance to have a house. There might be even some who are homeless. It's clear that we have to take care of those people. But when I see, a city like New York, who now is starting subsidizing people who are at the 60th percentile of the income distribution, that means that we imply that 60% of the household of New York will require subsidy in order to afford housing. Then I think that we have the wrong system. We have to reform it. We cannot accept that. So that was my last slide, and I would now be very eager to listen to my colleagues from Vancouver, who will certainly have much more interesting and deep insight about the city and its problem than I have at this moment. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is a true wizard in data visualization. He is able to take arcane statistics and present them in meaningful and interesting ways. He uses these skills very in unusual formats. He wanted to estimate how many candies he needed for Halloween. The trick-or-treat estimator he created is now used by thousands. When I found out that he had been inspired by Alain Bertaud's book to calculate the density gradient of Vancouver, I knew he needed to be part of this event. Now he has created a program so you can calculate the density gradient of any city in the world. We are lucky to have him in Vancouver. He comes via Germany, Chicago, Taiwan, and many other places. We are happy to have him here. Please welcome Jens van Bergmann.
It's my pleasure to be here and to participate in this event. And I want to pick up on where Alain Bertaud started talking, and that is the population density patterns that we have in the city. So I want to focus on a different aspect of it, which is population change between 1971 and 2016. So what we see here in green is where the population has grown, and the height gives us the population growth in people per unit area. And in purple, in the purplish tones, we see population loss. So Vancouver has grown quite unevenly, and the high density pattern that Alain Bertaud has showed in the central parts of the city, we can see that a lot of that has been growth that we know of, Yaletown, Cole Harbour, where we've added a lot of people. The West End has stayed somewhat mixed. Some areas have lost population, some have gained population, but really the big part that stands out for me is the whitish, neutral, pinkish areas that we see to the south of the downtown and the surrounding belt of downtown, where basically no growth has happened. We see similar patterns in West Vancouver and in other parts. So Vancouver has grown very unevenly geographically. How has this happened, really? We have in Metro Vancouver now a planning process that tries to allocate growth through different regions in the city. What we see that growth has slowed. So if we're looking at on the x-axis here, we see dwelling growth. On the y-axis, population growth. Generally, all kind of municipalities, the individual dots of municipalities here have grown roughly at the same rate in population to dwellings. There's some differences depending on the mix of what kind of dwellings we deliver. Is it single-family homes or is it smaller apartments? And Metro Vancouver overall, we've seen a slowing of dwelling growth. In each of these inter-census periods, we've grown slower when it comes to adding dwellings. And accordingly, population growth has also slowed. Now, what is governing where growth lands, mostly we do that through zoning. And what you see here is from the Metro Vancouver zoning project that Nathan Lauster and I have done. You see a unified zoning fabric that classifies it here into some simple zoning categories. A lot of our growth in the city of Vancouver has happened along the commercial zones recently, but also very importantly through spot zoning or comprehensive development. The yellow areas, our version of our yellow belt here, this is what we see in our population change map, where population really hasn't changed much. Zoning bylaws really function by limiting how we can share land, if we focus in on residential zoning. And it does it in several ways. It limits the number of dwelling units that we can have on a particular parcel, for example, by restricting stratification. it limits the ability to share a dwelling unit by defining what a family is. If you have single family zoning, you need to define what a family is, and we do this. And we restrict, for example, how many kitchens we can have in a dwelling unit, which restricts the ability to share it comfortably. And we limit the ability to subdivide a lot. And of course, on top of all of this is just how much can we actually build on top to accommodate things. For this short talk, I want to focus on this last bit, limiting the ability to subdivide just a physical lot. And here's a little snapshot in the city of Vancouver of the rules of how we do this. So here, each parcel is colored by its minimum frontage. So somehow we've decided in the city of Vancouver that in some lots, they can have a 30-foot frontage, but another lot nearby needs to have a 150-foot frontage minimum. So you can't subdivide it without this. There's really no clear rule of why this is the case, other than that's what it was when the rule came in place. So how did this happen? How did some of those strict rules come into place? And this really happened in the 80s. This is a newspaper clipping from the 80s that's decrying somebody who's trying to build a house on a 17-foot wide house on a small lot. And it's called an assault on the neighborhood. So here, the neighborhood groups finally managed to push back and got the permission for this house to be built revoked. Actually, later on, this house did get built eventually. But during this time is when some of those zonings got codified about the frontage throughout the city to prevent, prevent what? Prevent houses like this one, which are narrow on smaller lots than our regular houses, but we deemed to be an assault on the neighborhood. So this we can take and ask, well, what do we lose as a city by not allowing skinny lots? Or we can think of this maybe differently. Instead of subdividing the land, we could subdivide air parcels and allow stratification in some sense. But what do we lose? And we can calculate the opportunity cost that denies people opportunity to live close to jobs and amenities. And that comes out just if we look at the disallowing 1 to 2 lot splits to about $40 billion just for the city of Vancouver. So the opportunity cost of pushing people out is very large. And what do these people do? Well, here's a pattern of commutes, which unfortunately is not animated in this slide deck, but it shows you roughly how people commute into the city and between cities. And you see a back and forth, but there's a very strong trend to that draws commuters from the outside toward the central part of the city, between municipalities. And this is all I have for you today.
Our next presenter is a historian with a PhD in economic history. She is now the head of research right here in Vancouver with GWL Realty Advisors, with a global reach managing $15 billion in real estate. Now, this is not just an observation we can make, because she probably is responsible for your pension and your insurance. So we hope she does a good job. Her research and insights are much sought after around the world. Please welcome Wendy Waters.
So yes, as Mr. Sullivan was saying, that I help do the strategy research for about $15 billion in real estate under management for institutional and pension fund clients. We manage office buildings, rental apartments, industrial parks, and a little bit of retail. And since a lot of the other speakers were going to start with, we're going to talk about residential, I thought I would start with the office market, and particularly the labor market. That what really intrigues me about Alain Bertaud's work was how well it matches up with what we've been using as models for understanding real estate demand and demand growth. And it was models we built from actual experience. What drives real estate demand in Vancouver, in Toronto, in many cities, and I work, the 15 billion is across Canada that we do the strategy for. So this is a graph showing the growth of office employment in Vancouver, in the Metro Vancouver area, versus regular other jobs, all jobs. And what you'll notice is obviously office jobs have been growing faster than the rest of the jobs in this market, and that this really changed in about 2016. So think about the slope of this line as we look at some of the other real estate indicators that have happened in this market, particularly for residential, since 2016. A big change in the number of jobs. We know these are well-paying technology jobs in most cases, knowledge sector jobs. Amazon's growth here, of course, we've looked at, we've talked, you hear about in the news, Microsoft, those types of jobs. What's been the impact? Well, one impact has been on office demand. So employment is a leading indicator for office demand. And if you look at these charts, we have vacancy rates. The gold bar is the downtown AAA, so the newer big towers. The purple bar on there to pay attention to is the older downtown. You'll notice for the Metro Vancouver area, I also have the suburban vacancy rates on there. Everything got very tight right before the pandemic hit. In fact, this may have been the tightest market in North America for office space. On the right is the implications for rental rates, and again, you see them rising quite steadily after 2016. And one interesting thing to think about in terms of where do companies want to be, just like Jens was talking about, where do people want to be? If you look at the rental rates for the C-class downtown, that's your older downtown buildings, you'll notice that until very recently, C-class was actually more expensive than A-class, so the really high-quality new buildings in the suburbs. A lot of companies would rather be in older buildings downtown than in something newer in the suburbs. And a reason for that, again, is the employment market. It's where a lot of their employees want to be. Labor is the biggest expense by far of the office tenants, and so they're competing for talent. So they're going where their employees want to be, and they really like downtown Vancouver. I mean, who wouldn't? You're surrounded by water, there's great view of the mountains, there's great amenities, and it's where a lot of companies and their workforce want to be. And it's not just the office market and the office tenants that are interested in being closer to population centers. This is a graph of the industrial market for Vancouver. And the top two bars, you may be able to make them out on this chart, or the top bars, they're lines, are Vancouver and North Vancouver. So the City of Vancouver, City of North Vancouver, these are rental rates. These are the most expensive industrial markets in the Lower Mainland. There's a series of solid bars a little bit lower down. Those are the inner suburbs, so Burnaby, New Westminster, Richmond. And then the dotted lines are out to the Fraser Valley. And so the industrial market as well is positioning itself. The tenants that want to be closer to either employees, whether they are logistics or they're doing light manufacturing, or they want to be close to customers, or some of both. So as we think about how the city functions, everything you tend to buy at the store, you touch, at some point spent time in a warehouse or a small manufacturing facility in an industrial area. And the importance of being close to people, or in some cases, or transit, to be able to access that labor force is really important. And Alain Bertaud mentioned the sort of the 60-minute commute for workers, but that's also important as the 60 minutes from a customer base. And how does this get into rental housing? With GWL Realty Advisors, a huge part of our growth right now is rental housing, particularly back east. We'd love to have more sites in Vancouver. We do have 2 buildings opening in the next sort of 15 months in the Lower Mainland. We have about 8,000 in the pipeline. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what's driving rental rate growth, what's driving, where do people want to live, why, and what kind of product we should be building for them. So rental housing, rental rate trends, rental rates have been going up very steadily in the Vancouver market. Chart on the left is just CMHC rental rates. Big change in 2016, around the same time that job growth took off. And you'll also notice the chart on the right is just the home price index, which probably a lot of you have looked up. That also really took off in 2016. So again, this employment, especially growth in this office-oriented employment, has really been driving housing markets as well, and growth in demand. And one of the key thing to think about in this demand is that these average rental rates have been going up, but they certainly have been somewhat uneven. They've been going up more in the core, other than a little bit of a change during COVID, but I'm trying to think of I have to think about long-term trends 10 and 20 years in the future, not just what's happening under COVID. So this one you can see, the light green is before 1960, and the darker is buildings that were built more recently. And the rental rates, the cost of renting in an older building downtown or in Kitsilano is, in fact, it's in fact more expensive to be in the older buildings in the core than something newer out in the suburbs. And again, people are choosing that. You think, well, why wouldn't someone want to be in something new and nicer? But people really want to be in the core. And obviously the price of being in new housing in the core, the rental rates are even higher. And there's good, strong demand, and we do believe in this market. I'm going to actually just skip over this slide, I think, in the interest of time. But what's really encouraging, I think, for looking out for the next speaker is certainly that demand in Kitsilano, very high. People want to live there. It's close to the core. And it's that, along with downtown Vancouver, are markets where it does not seem to matter as much what the rents can be fairly high. There's a large market of employees who are coming for good-paying jobs that want to live there, and it gets frustrating when I hear at a public hearing, "Oh, we shouldn't build that because it's not affordable." A lot of this, it is affordable to a lot of people coming to do this work, and it would be nice to see them move into new product and leave lots of other opportunities for other people. So with that, I will wrap up, and we can go to the next speaker.
Surely one of the most fascinating and exciting developments of our age is the resurgence of Indigenous people of this land taking control of their destiny, charting a course of economic independence, changing the direction of our region. One of the leaders of this movement is our next guest. Graduated from SFU, 10 years later he was on the board. Most significantly, the board voted him chair and gave him the title Emeritus. 3 four-year terms as Squamish Council member, a leader in Indigenous developments, but one who constantly seeks traditional values, consulting with elders and members. Please welcome Chris Lewis. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Sam, and Hatsqueltanuyap to all of you, Siams, respected people. As mentioned, my ancestral name is Sitoktin. And thank you, Sam, for that excellent introduction. I'm here to talk to you about Indigenous resurgence around planning and economic development, and I'm going to focus on our project at Sanok, which is one of our ancient villages on the south side of Burrard Street Bridge. Sanok translates into inside the bay, so it's a geographical reference in terms of how it got its place name. And I also, on behalf of the Squamish people, want to welcome you to Kumkumalai, which is the place of Vancouver. Can everyone say Kumkumalai? It means the place of giant maple trees, and it's interesting now we're in a place of giant cement and concrete trees. And so it's quite symbolic and metaphoric. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sanok around how it's important to the history of Canada and to the history of the Squamish Nation people. And just really want to think about how Sanok represents a moment in our history and a significance not only for the Squamish Nation, but all of Canada and Vancouver proper. It's an opportunity on how to demonstrate Squamish Nation and Indigenous values through meaningful reconciliation and responding to climate change, and also creating a solution for the housing crisis that we all face. We focus on Indigenous excellence by being the largest Indigenous-led city building initiative in Canada that we know. And we're also going to bring our traditions and our customs forward around how we design this project. We're also going to provide hundreds, if not thousands, of opportunities for our people that should be the builders of this project. And it's going to be sustainable. It's going to have net zero carbon housing development, because we are, as Indigenous people, facing climate change everywhere we turn. It's also going to have district energy and fed by the massive metro sewer pipe that goes through the property. We're going to harness heat from that so that we can power the project. We're going to use timber like we always did with our traditional buildings and incorporate that in a modern context. And we're going to provide over 6,000 houses to the Vancouver market to help with the housing crisis. What's interesting about this is on our reserve land. So it's not subject to City of Vancouver zoning, and we can move as quick as we want or as slow as we want. And it's really focused on rental to ensure that we're looking at the market, and just like Alain talked about, we're letting the market dictate in terms of how we build. So just a little bit of a project overview here. It's quite symbolic. Every time I look at this picture, you can see the great density of Kamkamalai looking at the proposed density of Sanok, and how it's symbolic, and how as Squamish people we are rising to once again be city builders in our traditional lands, bringing forward our teachings and our innovation to a city that needs it, in a city where we want to be good neighbors. We want to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. But in order to get there, we need to understand the past. And I just really like to show this slide because the picture on the top is the original surveyed reserve of 80 acres in the late 1800s. So we had 80 acres to live on. And throughout the history, that slowly got expropriated away for railway, road right-of-ways, bridge right-of-ways. And then it was completely expropriated in 1913. And my ancestors got put on a barge and barged over to North Vancouver, and the reserve was expropriated. Luckily, after 30, almost 40 years of litigation, we got 10.48 acres left, which you can see now, and which the project is on. This is what we want to do. This is 12 buildings, construction hopefully this year, but I'm hearing probably next year in relations to this. And it's going to incorporate who we are and where we come from. And really the market is driving this. Rental vacancy rates are almost at zero in Kitsilano, and we continue to move forward. But we also want to provide attainable, affordable housing and housing for our own people as well. And we want to bring our people home to a village where we've largely been alienated from. So what does nation building look like? It looks like a built environment that redefines the landscape of Vancouver. It incorporates the culture of the Indigenous peoples of the land. And it incorporates new transportation infrastructure so we don't have to rely on the car. We're looking at investing over $100 million in a new transit infrastructure system through a streetcar partnership that would connect the project to not only Granville Island, but to the Canada line at Olympic Village so that we can move people in and out without the car. And then we're also, as I said, looking at innovative carbon neutral district energy projects as well. And how does Sanok define a new generation of reconciliation and leadership? As you can see, the nation is moving from a passive landlord position to an active developer and investor in our own lands. We're looking at historic partnerships with all levels of government and the industry and development industry here in Vancouver. And we're also looking at complete economic independence as a nation. When we've done some of the market analysis around getting E&Y to look at some of the numbers in terms of what this would look like on leased land, because we're not going to give the land away. We just got it back. So we're going to lease it out for 120 years, and that's looking like anywhere from $13 to $18 billion a return back to the nation, which creates that economic independence for us to do new and more innovative things. And it really creates an opportunity for our people to build this. So when they drive over the Broad Street Bridge and these towers are all done, they tell their children and their grandchildren, I built that, I helped build it. And that's the legacy that we're trying to create here. As I mentioned, this isn't a typical zoning process. In First Nations Squamish country, we had to go to the citizens of the Squamish Nation. all 3,000 voting members and asked them for permission. And they voted 87% in favor of this project. And they said, go and do it. Do it now, do it fast. And so we're moving as quick as we can. Just a little bit more here on sustainability, which I already talked about. I love showing these pictures, so. And then really looking at timber, and I know timber markets are real high, but we're the original timber builders of this land. We used to build 400-foot longhouses in Jericho and in Sanok, so why don't we do it here but go the other way? Rather than horizontal, we're going to go vertical. Again, this is putting 6,000 units onto the market in a very short time to help with Vancouver's housing crisis. And who are we attracting? We're attracting the young, the bright people that are working for Microsoft and Apple, the people in downtown, or in Gastown, Railtown, Yaletown, Mount Pleasant, Broadway Corridor, and False Creek Flats. There's so many innovative people there that want to experience an authentic Indigenous experience, and we're going to provide that community for them moving forward. And why does this all matter? Over the past 10 years, Vancouver has brought an average of 750 rental units per year onto the market. Sanok looks at bringing over 6,000 units onto the market within 5 to 10 years, which is 700 is going to be affordable. There's going to be many for our Squamish Nation members as well. And ultimately, this project stands to offer an inspiring solution for our housing needs, meaningful response to the climate change crisis that we face, and moving towards Indigenous reconciliation amongst Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, but also as Indigenous peoples to the land. We need to reconcile ourselves with the land and give back to the land what the land has given to us since the beginning of time. So thank you. I think that's my 5 minutes. OCM.
Many academics focus on their research and teaching, but few engage with the broader community. Not so with our next guest. He has an impressive list of professional and academic achievements, partly because of his history of growing up in Soviet-era Eastern Europe. He is passionate about the importance of all citizens to be engaged in their community. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. A professor at the Beedie School, Simon Fraser University, please welcome Andrey Pavlov.
So my main insight from Alain's work was really one simple thing, and it is that planners and economists, urban planners and urban economists actually have a lot more in common than meets the eye. And at the very least, we have the same goals. So everyone wants affordable housing, rental, owner-occupied, everyone wants nice cities, everyone wants good infrastructure. We all want really the same thing. The list is long, but I think the overlap is nearly 100%. Where we run into trouble is, in my view, when we mandate too many of those outcomes. There are some outcomes and some goals that are fantastic, like affordable housing and affordable rental housing in this case, that are not subject to mandates. And yet our history is, with all due respect, is that we have been trying to mandate those outcomes. We've had rent control for as long as I can remember. More recently, we have rental-only zoning. Even more recently, the city of Vancouver is considering rent control even for in-between tenants, not just for the tenants, for single occupancy rooms, and so on and so forth. And the problem is it has not worked. So we cannot seem to get above 1% vacancy rate in Vancouver. And, you know, of course, we need at least 3 to have a healthy market. And it really hasn't worked for the affordable segment of the market either. We keep housing, I don't want to say housing fewer people, but there are more and more people we are unable to house. Now, at the same time, to be fair, economics can't offer all solutions either. So the moment you have a mispriced resource, like the space on this telephone pole over there, you get congestion. And the moment you get congestion, no one can do really anything. So, and of course the solution is, in economics is to price our resources correctly. This is not really possible in urban setting. So, what's the solution? Well, the solution is that I'm really going to offer two, and they're both, in the way I'm going to offer them, are simple. They're hard to implement, but here you go. So the first one is, let's find the low-hanging fruit. And the permitting process at municipal governments is one low-hanging fruit. I have not seen a single person who says the permitting process should take 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. So thank you, Chris, for being able to circumvent that and move us faster. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We need to do that for everyone. All right, so here's one graph, one particular view of that. It's not my graph. I haven't been able to get the data from the city of Vancouver myself, but the graph seems to suggest that a third of the units in application in 2016 were still under review in 2019. So, that's all nice, but that low-hanging fruit isn't going to get us all the way there, right? We need to accept some trade-offs. And one such trade-off is, in my view, that we should let urban planners and politicians choose priorities, but then let economists figure out mechanisms to achieve those priorities in a natural way. And, one obvious way is to increase supply. So again, thank you, Chris, for doing that. And we know this works because not far south from here, there is a city that has 10% vacancy rate, and that the vacancy rate was before the pandemic. How did they achieve that? How did Seattle achieve normal or even higher than usual vacancy rate? Well, they built 13 times more rental units in 2018 than the city of Vancouver did. And I know time is tight, so I'm just going to go straight to one little proposal I have, and that is to bribe people, all right? So why do we need to bribe anyone? Well, we need to bribe anyone because densification, the only way we can get these additional supplies through densification, there's no question about that. And densification kind of upsets a lot of people one way or another. Now, whether that's justified or not is beyond the point. My view is we need to take 2 steps. Number one, auction densification rights. So don't draw maps on the line, don't do anything like that. Decide how many units of additional density we're going to allow every year and auction those to current landowners and potential developers. And then take the money and use them to compensate the neighbors for whatever harm they think they're getting. And now people are laughing, and that's fantastic. I don't know if that's laughing because, oh, that's a crazy guy, or, oh, that's a really good idea. Either way, I'm happy. But at least I think you're getting the point. There is enough value created in densification that absolutely everyone can be made better off. There's no need to fight over it. There are mechanisms that economics has developed that can distribute the additional value in a way that everyone is better off and happier. So the bottom line here, we need to turn housing into water, and right now it's into diamonds. Why are diamonds more expensive than water? It's not because they're more valuable, it's because they're harder to get. So the only way to achieve long-term affordability is to turn diamonds into water, to turn housing into water, meaning it's easy to get more. And then housing will become more affordable. Thank you so much, appreciate your laughter.
Our next guest is a professor at the SCARP Planning School at UBC. When I learned she was already using Alain's material in her class, I immediately asked her to speak at an urban lunch. She told me the timing would make it very difficult for her, but I insisted. I learned just how committed she was to her profession when she logged on to our urban lunch and gave her presentation by a Greek waterfront while preparing for her wedding. Amazing. In her research, she uncovers innovative data for the study of housing, mobility, and marginalization. Please welcome Professor Julia Harten.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. What a great event. I decided for today I was going to talk about teaching, as I now learned one of many educators among the speakers. But I thought I would report back from the classroom where future planners are being trained. So I'm going to talk about a class that I just designed. Actually, I was hired to design, so I started my position last year, and I was asked to design a new course, a brand new course on real estate and planning. And why I decided to talk about this today is because I designed this course very much, I think, in the spirit of Alain Bertaud's work, which I've been reading since grad school and greatly admire. So just to give you some general context, I think the spirit or the sentiments that he describes, planners being generally skeptical of economists, is very much alive in the classroom. So I did encounter that, I do encounter that. I just started teaching the class again last week. But there's also a general curiosity about the economics of city and a real eagerness to understand. In this case, my class is about real estate development in particular. How do real estate developers look at cities? How do they approach space? What is an economics of space, of urban space? And so, there is this understanding, which I think is fundamental to Alain Bertaud's book, which is to understand markets, to interact with markets, to regulate markets. We first need to understand markets as planners. And so in the first class of this course that I taught just last Thursday, we read about different ways that the literature has kind of theorized the relationship between planners and real estate developers. And to set the stage, perhaps, if you like, I let my students read the introductory chapter of Alain Bertaud's book, which basically lays out what planners know well, which are cities, relationships in cities, social processes, culture, the importance of place, and what economists know well, which is land markets, migration in cities as labor markets. And then with that in mind, I let them read some more contradicting thoughts about real estate development and planning, which is a famous article by Richard Pisa titled "Who Builds America?", which basically reminds planners that a lot of the decision as to what gets built is not made by planners, it's made by real estate developers. So a big incentive to actually try to work with them. But then I also let them read some literature that is more critical of an economics perspective on cities. In particular, some work by a historian who traces back the relationship between property rights, value of land, value of labor, and racism to the Jim Crow area, and kind of lets us follow his tracing the continuity of those relationships until the present day. And then I also let them read a piece by Sarah Safransky with a contemporary example of some of these continued institutions being relevant today. So that's a piece on Detroit, where one of the examples that she draws on is a white property developer getting permits to redevelop a vacant piece of land, which actually is not vacant at all, but has been used by low-income and people of color community members for years. Unfortunately, their labor and use was not recognized. So all that to say that in designing this course and training future urban planners in how they might approach real estate development, real estate developers, I built the whole course very much around, I think, the spirit of Alain Bertaud's work, which is that planners can learn a lot from economists. But I also emphasize, and maybe that's a somewhat different perspective that I bring to you here tonight, I also emphasize that there is risk in being too market-driven and believing perhaps too much in the power of markets. As an academic, I would distinguish between economics and capitalism, but we live in a capitalistic society, and a society that places a lot of value on numbers, on markets, on money. Right? And so I still teach that in that situation, in the circumstances that we're in, there's a clear job description for planners to negotiate for better welfare for all, which often translates into advocating for those that are marginalized. And yeah, that's all I have today for you. Thank you very much.
So our final presenter was a Vancouver city planner with major projects, went to London to work for the Duke of Westminster, the largest landowner in London, came back to Vancouver and established his company, Livable City Planning, where he has 5,000 units of housing he's working to bring to reality. He brings in important insights from both sides of the planning desk. He was the last graduate student of Walter Hardwick, the icon of Vancouver urban planning, and he helped Jane Jacobs write her last book. Please welcome Michael Mortensen.
Emergent order in the livable city. My thesis here is that we can't have order without design. We can't have design without order. I'm the balancing speaker, I think, to conclude this thing and say that urban planners have to pay a lot more attention to market forces. Developers have to pay a lot of attention to design, naturally, to get anything built. You have to be an expert at design. And when I say design, I don't just mean architecture. I mean the DNA of cities, the urban plans, the policies, the guidelines, the rules, the fees, the CACs, all of those things. But I find urban planners have historically not been very great at market economics. We need to fix that because we have huge problems. So Order Without Design, Alain Bertaud's book is fantastic, tracking the forces of markets on cities. And absolutely, we need to be better at understanding them. Order Without Design. Would you like to live in a city that is predicated only on order? So the cover of Alain's book is Jakarta, which has got rapid urban growth, congestion, gridlock traffic, and flooding, and is no longer going to be the capital of Indonesia because it's being moved. That doesn't exactly work. So Order Without Design is not a great idea, but you have to pay attention to the forces of order. Cities are complex open systems. They're often near equilibrium. You think they're stable, but they're not. We went through deindustrialization, the post-industrial revolution. I think we're going through another one right now in terms of the way people work. People are changing the way they're working, changing the way they can live, which then changes the shape of our cities. Our cities are shaped by both markets and regulation. As Sam mentioned, I knew Jane Jacobs a little bit. I helped her edit her last book. She's a bit grumpy, dark age ahead. But she talks about moral systems, the systems of commerce and the systems of governance, two different ones. But order versus design is a false dichotomy. People value design, markets value design. If you develop buildings, you know this, that you need to pay attention to design. But design, let's think about the DNA of our cities and the rules that guide them. It's a balance of interests, right? We need to look at design, costs, values, what society wants. You can't build things in a vacuum. And I think our market is telling us that we are at failure point in terms of equity and the way that development is affecting everybody. We need to change it. 25 years ago almost, I took this article to the Congress of the New Urbanism. I was a plenary speaker, so a young graduate student, didn't know what I was talking about, and where I met Jane Jacobs. And this is an article with Arthur Erickson saying, well, we're going to get 1 million people in the region. What are we going to do? How are we going to grow? And that is a question we have to have again. And indeed, we did get almost 1 million people in the last 25 years, just as he predicted. His wish, I think, was that Vancouver would accept more of that growth, but that hasn't been the case. The suburbs have been absorbing all that growth. But as everyone knows, all roads lead to Rome, all spokes in the hub lead to the center of Vancouver. Everyone wants to live in the center. The pressure in Vancouver is pretty phenomenal. This is a livable region strategy, goes back to the early 70s. Back to that question of how should our city grow? As a region, we said, look, we know we have these market forces, but we need to shape them. So, we have this tension between design, the DNA of all of our cities, and market forces. So to harness the energy of markets, this is Aikido. We know we can harness the energy of markets to better understand market forces and leverage the language of economics and design to create better cities. Not just Vancouver, all over the region. So we go back to Jane Jacobs' moral syndromes. There's one of guardians, right? They're there to prevent bad things from happening. Historically, that's where planning comes from. The unfettered excesses of capitalism are leading to crappy cities all over Canada, all over the world. England, they brought urban planning to Canada in the early 1900s. And then there's the moral systems of commerce, trade. So these two systems. So which one are you? Who's the trader and who's the guardian? Well, it depends on your perspective. If you're submitting a development application, maybe you're the Wookiee. I don't know. You're building rental housing, trying to address the housing deficit. From the perspective of the planners, sometimes they see developers as the Klingon. But at the end of the day, it's meaningless because it's a false dichotomy. We need both. So we need to be design literate. Developers have to be design literate. I think most developers are pretty good at that. I'm a planner developer. I'm a weird hybrid. Or maybe I'm a Wookiee, Klingon, I don't know, some sort of half and half thing. But guardians need financial literacy. And really, a good example is San Francisco, inclusionary zoning 2015. The guardians of the day, including the city council, said, look, that's it. 25% of all new units are going to be deeply affordable. What happened? That year, 0 new building permits for the city of San Francisco. Who won? Nobody, right? So clearly, guardians weren't paying attention to market forces. Local example, Patrick, you're here. We spar, we're online, we're in the Tyee, but this is from Sick City, which has got some sick math. So Patrick says $60,000 a year will finance a $450,000 mortgage, 20-year mortgage at 3%, which leaves $250 a square foot buildable for the land. Wrong. $66,000 doesn't fund $450,000 mortgage. If you have Excel, at PMT is the function, calculates your mortgage for you, it actually funds less than $300,000 for a mortgage. So we need basic financial literacy, especially if we're advising councils, politicians, developers. You need to you have basic financial literacy. So the $250 land residual, when you actually apply the math and you include all the costs imposed by guardians, so city fees, metro fees, TransLink taxes, provincial fees, not even including GST or property transfer tax on the sale of these things, is 10% of the price. The land residual is not $250 a square foot, it's $130. So we need to get real, and I'm offering my services, Patrick, wherever you are, for free. We need to collaborate, right? We can't be Wookiees, we can't be Klingons, we have to be people to solve all these problems. So we need a responsibility to do accurate work, we need to tackle market problems with a language of urban land economics and the type of information that Alain is sharing with us. We need to collaborate more. And we have a lot of company. Planners have a lot of company in the regulation of markets because economists are also involved in this at the federal level, provincial level, regional level, TransLink, and all the sort of cities. I think we all have to play in the same sandbox. So right now, I think the challenge is we've got all of this turbulence in our housing market. All this market information, demand. I would characterize our market as low supply and high cost. And what's making it difficult and challenging for the development industry is that we have layers of regulation all doing other things, sometimes canceling each other out. But I would characterize it as turbulence because we have to pay more attention to the market outcomes of regulation. So time, this is one of the big problems, and time is my problem right now. Our plans are dated, right? They're ancient. Why are we listening to Harlan Bartholomew, who's 130 years old, telling us how we're going to live, when a house in Vancouver is $1.7 million? It's like a benchmark price for a house. Guess what? You need $300,000 of income to afford that reasonably. You know, it's not sustainable. This is a massive economic equity planning failure for Vancouver, but also other cities in the region. So, radical idea. Why don't we put in a requirement that every land use zone has to meet an economic equity test, right? A market key performance indicator. That if the zoning that's in place doesn't generate housing that's affordable to, say, I don't know, a third of the population, then we have to throw it out. We cannot have that zoning. So RS1 zoning is classic. So I got to close up in a minute or two, but listen, if you want vitamin A affordability, you're going to need some vitamin D squared, density and design. We need to adapt to the market forces. We need to harness them. Single family zoning is dead. We need to break rules on the way we build small units and more compact livable units that are more affordable. We need to challenge our guardian thinking and respond to market forces. We can design with order, and that's my closing statement.
Just to briefly respond to Michael, although we really agree on most things. Maybe we disagree just on semantics of what I mean by design. You know, I'm a Beaux-Arts graduated architect. They call the Beaux-Arts of Paris. So design is certainly one of my concern, and I still is. What I meant by order without design is that we have to respect this spontaneous order when it comes to the city. And I think that is in the spirit of Jane Jacobs, by the way. Now, I really greatly appreciated also, you know, the contribution of Julia Harten about teaching. I think that's probably what is missing the most, is that teaching design and teaching at the same time economics. You know, not this dichotomy that we have where you know, we have on one side economists who understand well all the city works, but usually do not work in the city. They are mostly academics, but they teach economists, but they don't participate really planning. They make studies of what is happening. You know, for instance, all the problem about zoning, which were discussed today, are certainly the subject of papers by economists, and excellent papers. For some reason, it doesn't come out of the peer-reviewed papers. You know, it doesn't come out in the real life. So I think that one of the problems will be to get economists to participate in the zoning, not to criticize the zoning after it has been voted by the city, but to participate in it. And when I say zoning, again, that's about boogaboo, but of course, infrastructure is also very important. The length of you know, the process for giving building permits is also very important. I think that everybody today has discussed this aspect. So now I'm very eager to hear again the comments of my colleagues here who participate in those talks, because again, I'm here to learn more than to preach. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Alain. Thank you so much. Now we only have a short time, so I've received some texts from the audience in a work from Anywhere Global Market. COVID's teaching us this. What about the urban land market, the labor market of a city? Does it become irrelevant? And then another question, what is an appropriate density in the next 5 to 10 years in higher density areas? And amenities, a SNOC regarding schools, community centers when there's no development fees. So those are 3 questions that I thought were very interesting. I think maybe I'll ask Wendy about the job market and the COVID, how that's affected.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's certainly been the, $50 million, $15 billion question since COVID started, is what's going to be the long-term implications of the fact that so many office workers have been working from home for so long and have tried it out. I think if you look at what people do in office spaces, it was changing pre-COVID. COVID accelerated some trends, it put a magnifying glass on some trends, and how people have been working in office space have been changing. Much more collaborative. It's much more of a place where you're working with other smart people. That's why in the knowledge sector, why so many knowledge workers want to come to Vancouver. There's other smart people to work with. And working together on Zoom, I've been doing it for a year and a half with my team that's very talented. It is still very hard. It is nothing like being with them in person. And I think a lot of people who work with teams would agree. So we've been surveying, looking at how things have been going with different types of workers. And, the office space will be different. It's going to be much more of an experience. Again, the downtown experience is what will be competitive. But I think there also will be that flexibility that we've all had, over the last 18 months. Certainly that is coming, but that was coming before COVID. So it's really just put a magnifying glass on things. So my own belief, and maybe I'm biased because, we have a lot of office space, is that 4 or 5 years from now, we won't notice, we'll notice that COVID happened, but the trend may not be all that different than it would have been had COVID not happened. That it just put a magnifying glass and an acceleration on some trends that were already happening.
Thank you, Wendy. On the issue of density appropriate in the next 5-10 years, Jens, you've done a lot of work on the mapping of density. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if we're thinking about, there's enormous pressure to live in Vancouver, in downtown. We all know stories of people who wanted to come here and didn't come, or who wanted to stay here and didn't stay. And we have to create space for these people to come and live here and work here and play here. And so the question is, where do we do this? The easy choices are gone, right? The industrial lands that we might not need, we've built things there. This is gone. So really where we're at right now is we have to start to eat into what Nathan Lauster has called the Great House Reserve. So the swath of yellow that I showed on the map that is quite abundant, so we have a lot of it, that's good. So we should start to think of this more as an opportunity. And in some way that ties a little bit into the next question that was asked, which was about schools and amenities. We have these areas where population has decreased, where school enrollment has been dropping, where we in some sense have a need to really, a need of more people, more children, to use those amenities, to actually go to those schools. And so there's a great match, really, if we think about where the density should land.
Thank you. Chris, there was another question that also came in about not only about the amenities, but if SNOC had been under city regulations, how much density could you get, and how many years would it take you to get it? So those two questions.
I think I'll ask everybody in the audience that one, but yeah, I think around density and zoning from a First Nations perspective, how we're providing certainties, we have service agreements with Metro Vancouver along with the City of Vancouver to kind of basically level the playing field in terms of services and amenities and how we're going to be providing all of those other aspects. There's also the challenge on the nation to develop our own DCC laws and other kind of fee laws so that we're kind of creating an equal playing field as well. But largely we've inherited a relationship where municipalities have used density or the rezoning process to kind of hinder First Nations development and move in that aspect. So I think we're in a different era now where there's a lot of talk around reconciliation and allowing First Nations to showcase that we want to be good neighbors, that we want to build something that fits with the city, what fits with the neighbors. We're not in the business of, building casinos in the middle of nowhere that doesn't work and all of those other aspects. So I think just getting the boogeyman out of under the bed, I think is the biggest challenge sometimes we do as First Nations to ensure that we're moving forward in a communal way, solving not just the nation's problems, but the city's problems as well.
Thank you so much. Maybe can I ask the other three if they could make a comment on one of those issues, or maybe if there's something you thought there should be. Maybe I'll ask Michael, do you want to start first?
Yeah, in terms of where can we accommodate new growth, I mean, I just observed that in addition to the employment growth we're seeing in our region, the federal government's accepting 1.2 million new migrants to Canada over the next 3 years. If a third of them moved to this region, or a quarter, there's easily 300, 400,000 more people. So we definitely need to grow. We need to partner, I think, with the development industry, the communities, councils, planners, developers, to find those opportunities. They're along transit corridors. There are, of course, the great, the RS1, the single detached neighborhoods that can accommodate far more density. I think we have to toss a lot of dated old planning and come up with some new opportunities. We know how to build these places. We have examples of higher density but high amenity living. So they're all over the city. I think we need to really put our minds to it.
Thank you. Julia, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Actually, on the topic of density as well, my research, and I didn't talk about that today, is on rental housing and a lot of informal rental housing. And actually, I talked with Jens before the event that it's kind of remarkable how little we know about the rental market, especially the not purpose-built rental market, so the secondary market. And I think there's a big opportunity still to gather better data and understand that market much better to then inform policy.
Thank you. And Andrey?
Yeah, I mean, there's, at least on the question of where we should have that density, I think auctioning density rights is going to do it. That's the mechanism, because that will let the market decide where the most value can be created through that additional density. And so the question, how much? Well, we're going to start small, I suspect, to get over the hurdle. And then the question will be, how much are those density rights worth? And if they're worth a ton, then we have a problem. And if they become worth less and less, then we're doing well. So the market will tell us how much density we need and where, rather than lines on the map.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to thank everyone who's made this evening possible. And to Alain Bertaud, thank you for what you are doing for Vancouver and cities around the world. Please thank Alain.